All right, let's go ahead and start. Welcome, everyone. My name is Whitney Albright. I work at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and help to facilitate the Conservation Lecture Series. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special installment of the lecture series in honor of California Biodiversity Day. We'll hear more on that in a moment, but first, I'm going to start us off with just a few quick logistics here. You've probably noted that or noticed that you're muted. That's to help us preserve the audio quality for the recording. We are recording the talk today, and it'll be available on our lecture series website after the talk. There is a link here at the bottom of the slide where you can find more information on the lecture series, video links, an archive of older videos, etc. As far as flow for today, we're going to go through, after a few introductory remarks, we'll go through our presentations, and then we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of all of our 3 talks today. That said, we'd love for you to send us your questions all along the way as they come up, and we will relay those to our guest speakers at the end. In order to submit a question, you'll notice in your icons at the bottom, there's a Q&A icon. Please submit questions through that Q&A feature. And spoiler alert, we do have multiple speakers today, so please do indicate which speaker your question is for. You'll notice there's also a chat box. You can use the chat box to communicate with one another, to send us a message, but please keep your questions in the Q&A box. They're just a little bit easier for us to track and sort that way. Okay, I think that's all I have by way of some ground rules for today. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dina Spatz, who is DFW's Biodiversity Coordinator, to tell us a little bit more about Biodiversity Day and to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. So Dina, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Whitney. So as Whitney said, my name is Dina Spatz. I'm the Biodiversity Coordinator at CDFW, and I help coordinate California Biodiversity Day, which we're really excited about. This is an annual event that started in 2018. It actually started on the day that then Governor Brown signed the state's first biodiversity initiative, really aimed at addressing biodiversity loss across the state. And it's really since become foundational as part of the California 30 by 30 movement, which is to protect 30% of the state's land and coastal waters by 2030, along with biodiversity conservation. So California Biodiversity Day is September 7th, and it is celebrated throughout the week this year from the 7th to the 15th. And I'm really excited to share that there have been over 200 events coordinated across the state by over 150 different organizers, from state parks to CDFW to land trusts and conservancies, Audubon chapters, California Native Plant Society chapters, lots of community groups. Just as you can see from the map, there are really events throughout the state, from wildlife areas to urban centers. And so there's likely an event happening near you, so please check out the website. I'll put it in the chat in the moment, but the bit.ly that you can see on the screen will also take you there if you type that into your URL. And I just wanted to share a few ways that you can get involved from home without even joining an event, although events are also kind of uplifting different kinds of community science activities. So one is, if you're a birder or if you would like to be a birder, you can go birding for Biodiversity Day. If you use eBird, you can document the birds you observe there and share your checklists with California Biodiversity Day. So far, over 266 bird species have been observed since September 7th, and those checklists shared with us from across the state. And you can see from the map, lots of different people from different counties have submitted their checklists. It really gives us this awesome snapshot of the biodiversity of birds in California in September. So this is an awesome opportunity to get involved, and this trip report will continue through the 15th of the month. And another really fun way you can participate is by using iNaturalist, which is a free app that you can download on your phone, and by documenting the nature around you. So there's this biodiversity challenge to find 30 wild species from anywhere in California. It could be a spider on your wall or a tree in the forest, really any nature that you see that's wild, you can document and share. So to participate, you do need to download the app and make an account. It's free. Then you have to join the Find 30 Species Challenge. Again, I'll share the link, and there's a QR code on the screen. And then from there, starting now, Anything you document and submit in the app will be collected as part of this large community science challenge. And I just wanted to share that so far since the 7th, over 300 people across the state have taken the challenge and documented almost 2,000 species, and we expect that number to go up pretty soon. This includes everything from bobcats and cute birds to tiny little weird fuzzy looking growths on plants called galls. September is also gall month, so it's a fun time to learn about these common critters around you. So just keep a lookout for the nature around you. You really can find it anywhere, and that's kind of part of the point of Biodiversity Day, is to really connect and learn how to observe nature, and help also share that information with biodiversity scientists and people who make conservation decisions, because the data that goes into iNaturalist is really used across the globe by these different groups. Lastly, if you're a species expert, you can help identify the observations that have been observed in iNaturalist. You can see in some of these pictures, there's a green RG box. That means research grade. Those are observations that people submitted and have been verified by the community. And once it becomes research grade, it can be used for science. So with that, let's get to our featured presenters. I'm really, really excited to co-host this conservation lecture series webinar on accessing California's urban biodiversity and green spaces. Please stay tuned until the end, because we're going to have some special animal guests as well as our amazing presenters. This is a really important topic for many reasons. Big picture, one of the main objectives of the state-led California 30 by 30 initiative is to really improve access to nature for all of Californians, alongside protection of biodiversity and natural habitat. So urban spaces provide these really immense opportunities for people to connect and enjoy nature, and for nature itself to also thrive in those spaces as well. So we're going to learn a lot more about that, and I'm really excited to introduce our three guests today, Jade Wen, Cesar Estienne, and Corky Quirk. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and start introducing Jade. And then Jade, you can you can start sharing your screen as well. So let's see. Okay, I believe I've stopped sharing my screen. And Jade, you can go ahead and I will introduce you. So Jade is a project manager at Nature for All, whose portfolio includes advocating for urban greening, open space, and park equity in Los Angeles County. Jade has previously worked in environmental advocacy and environmental science education across the state of California, and has a background in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. She grew up in the Los Angeles area, exploring and hiking the San Gabriel Mountains and foothills, and her favorite ecosystems are coastal sage scrub and chaparral. So today, Jade is here, and her presentation is Los Angeles County Urban Parks, Green Spaces, and Biodiversity, the need for a more inclusive lens when working on greening within urban landscapes. So welcome, Jade. Take it away.
Thanks, Dina. And I had no idea there was a gall month. Sorry, I learned something. So hello, everyone. My name is Jade Wynn, she, her, hers, and I'm a project manager at Nature for All, a Los Angeles-based and community-oriented environmental and social justice nonprofit. And Nature for All's mission is to build a diverse base of support, ensuring equitable access to the many benefits that nature provides. We advocate for policies and programs that protect our natural spaces, create access in underserved communities and neighborhoods, and connect people with public lands in order to improve public health and foster a generation of environmental leaders. So before I move on to the next slide, I want you all to just kind of think about what comes to mind when you think about Los Angeles. Just a few terms or descriptors. Maybe you might think about the Dodgers or the film industry, but when you think about the physical area of LA, what do you see? And a lot of people might see something like this. Most people think of LA as a sprawl, mostly concrete, a highly urbanized area with impermeable surfaces, generally a place that's very dry and lifeless. And natural is not usually a word that's associated with LA. And in some ways that makes sense, but it's actually not a fair characterization, fair in many senses of the word. So I showed you this image, which might be a stereotypical view of LA, but these are also images of LA. And believe it or not, Los Angeles is located in a biodiversity hotspot, the same California floristic province that covers much of California, parts of Oregon, Baja, and a tiny bit of Nevada. So we're actually located in an area of very high biodiversity. And we at Nature for All know that biodiversity and nature exists in LA because our biggest campaign in LA was the establishment and eventual expansion of the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument. Over 17 million residents live in Southern California within a 90-minute drive of the San Gabriel Mountains. And the San Gabriel Mountains make up roughly 70% of Los Angeles County's open space. We're very grateful to President Obama, who during his term established the monument under the Antiquities Act in 2014, and also to President Biden, who used those same powers to expand the monument in May of this year, and was able to protect an additional 106,000 acres. And this action protected native habitat and the plants and wildlife contained within, but also protected much needed green space for park pool communities in LA County. And you'll see on the screen here the expansion area that was protected, including some very popular areas for visitors throughout LA County in the foothill area. So as I mentioned, Nature for All connects people to nature, and we do that through a variety of programming. Many of the community members that we spoke to when spreading the message about the monument had never been outside of their neighborhoods. They'd never been to the beach, which feels very much like something that when you live in California, and especially in Southern California, is kind of an automatic place to go. But many had also never been to the San Gabriel Mountains in their own backyard and didn't realize that they could even access the mountains. And among some of the things that Nature for All does is we take people to these natural spaces through our Explore the Coast and All Aboard for Nature trips. And we do this at no cost to the participant. We provide transportation and lunch. And there are so many people who have let us know that they wouldn't have been able to have even known about these places or have been able to spend time outdoors with their families without these nature trips. We also have leadership development programs in which we empower underrepresented community leaders, and we have them become civically engaged and advocate for their communities through these programs. We have delivered educational programs and leadership development training to thousands of residents and have built a legacy of environmental ambassadors and advocates through these leadership development programs. And of our program participants, 77% identify as low income, 68% identify as women, 57% identify as Latinx or Latina, and 90% identify as BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. We also have workforce development programs that provide young people and veterans with the skills and resources needed to make them competitive applicants for green jobs in the environmental and conservation field. And what you can see on screen are just a few of the workshops and programs that we've offered in the past. And I just wanted to share a few more images of the hikes, workshops, and nature trips that we take community members on. We explore parks and green spaces throughout LA County. These are pictures at Deukmejian Wilderness Park, named after the former governor. The image on the left are some of our young naturalists at the Stone Barn Nature Center. And then to the right, you can see a child taking a closer look at some native buckwheat. And oftentimes on these trips, we do engage in community science and we teach people all about their local ecosystems. So this is these are a few images of our Forest Health BioBlitz in 2023, or habitat survey. We did this at the San Dimas Experimental Forest, which is managed by the Forest Service. They do hydrology and ecology experiments there. We used iNaturalist to record the data collected during this event. And just in case you were wondering, yes, This was a California Biodiversity Week event. And just last week, we also held a bird watching event led by a member of our Leadership Academy at Peck Road Water Conservation Park. This was the site of a former pebble quarry, and it's since been transformed into a park and migratory bird habitat. It's part of the proposed Emerald Necklace Network of Parks, which is a plan that proposes a connected system of parks, green spaces, and trails throughout LA County. And it was a pretty great event. There were quite a few bird sightings in the area, different species. And originally, before when it was a pebble quarry, you wouldn't have been able to see this level of diversity in the area. So I just shared some of the ways that people are able to engage with existing nature in LA County and how we as an organization do our best to provide these opportunities to access nature and experience the biodiversity contained within these beautiful spaces. But the sad truth is that the majority of people in LA County do not have local access to nature. What you see on the screen is a map from the 2016 Los Angeles County Park Needs Assessment. And what this shows are areas of very high need and high need in orange and red. Over half of all residents within LA County do not have access to a park or publicly accessible green space within walking distance. That's defined within half a mile of their home or residence. You'll see that the areas of high need and very high need are concentrated in the urban core, but also are dispersed throughout LA County in the San Fernando Valley and parts of the San Gabriel Valley. So you'll see quite a big green space and parks deficit here. And what they found in a subsequent analysis in 2022 in the Parks Needs Assessment Plus is that there were deep inequities in the distribution of parks and green space throughout LA County. And many of these same neighborhoods that lacked access to green space also suffered from environmental injustices, including higher pollution burdens, lack of access to public transportation, and health disparities. So Nature for All also leads the Parks Needs Assessment Plus Coalition. And it was a coalition that was intentionally formed to be the community voice in the Parks Needs Assessment implementation process for LA County. With our coalition of partners that you can see here, we not only seek to establish parks and green spaces for those most in need, but we also recognize the need for restoration of degraded lands, such as brownfields, landfills, and oil fields, especially in lower income communities of color, where vulnerable populations and environmental burdens are often concentrated. The coalition is also funded by some of our local conservancies who recognize the need to work with community members. This work is also funded by some of these local conservancies, and they recognize the need to work with community members to develop a shared vision for conservation and restoration in LA County. This is LA County's 30 by 30 plan. So this is LA County's 30 by 30 plan, and it differs from the state strategy in that the state's current 30 by 30 strategy, as presented in the Pathways document, doesn't adequately address the environmental justice concerns of the LA region, or the role that urban biodiversity and habitat conservation plays in mitigating the effects of today's climate crisis. And in order to represent the needs of the LA region and apply the state's 30 by 30 mandate equitably, the state must look beyond traditional conservation of natural lands and start considering the urban landscape a little bit more. So in a region such as Los Angeles County, the reality is that in order to achieve the goal of providing access to nature and quality parks and green spaces for communities that have the highest need, we must prioritize the remediation and restoration of degraded lands. These same communities and neighbors, as I've mentioned, also face inequitable environmental and pollution burdens that can partly be addressed through the healing of these lands, through by how we reevaluate how we conduct conservation and within our region. The goal is to have multi-use and multi-benefit green spaces, which incorporates habitat and nature-based solutions to climate change while addressing the needs of the human community. So especially in urban areas, the argument is that habitat is too fragmented, but connectivity needs to start somewhere. And this is the Emerald Necklace Vision Plan, Emerald Necklace that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. And it's based on the 1930s Olmsted Brothers vision for the LA region. And as you can see here, what the vision would include is a connected system of parks, green spaces, and trails where biodiversity can flourish, where people can gather and recreate, and where wildlife could freely travel throughout the region. What we've seen through our work is that people from marginalized identities in urban areas such as LA love nature, and they care about biodiversity and they understand the value of it. But because urban biodiversity is not often seen as quote unquote real nature, it tends to be overlooked when it comes to funding opportunities and conservation efforts. And we hope as an organization that will change, and we're working towards a better vision for LA County.
Wow, thank you, Jade. That was an incredible talk. I've learned so much about what you guys are doing in LA County. So everyone, please, if you have questions for Jade, please put them in the Q&A section and mention Jade's name so that we can direct it towards her. So next, I would like to introduce Cesar Estienne. Cesar is an urban ecologist at Second Nature Ecology and Design, and he's also a PhD candidate in UC Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management in Dr. Christopher Schell's lab. Cesar investigates how societal inequities and injustices, such as historical redlining in the US, socioeconomic differences, and environmental health disparities shape wildlife ecology, urban biodiversity, and biodiversity sampling by weaving together ecological theory with environmental justice. Cesar works with and alongside NGOs, government agencies, local residents, and research institutions to understand the factors shaping local ecologies and what this means for improving our cities. So welcome, Cesar. Cesar's title is The Social Ecological Legacies of Injustice on Urban Biodiversity. So you can go ahead and share your screen and take it away. Thank you.
Sweet, thank you. Can you guys see the screen well?
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you guys so much for having me. As Dina said, my name is Cesar. I am at Second Nature Ecology and Design in UC Berkeley. And today I'll be talking with y'all about the social ecological legacies of injustice on urban biodiversity and why urban biodiversity can be a bit complex to understand sometimes. And so to help frame our conversation today, we have to start with kind of why cities and why urban biodiversity. And so roughly 55% of the world's population today, so that's about 4.48 billion people, live in cities today, and that number is expected to increase to 66% by 2050. And so as people are moving into cities, that means landscape changes and alterations are happening to accommodate those populations. And so new urban land cover, things like roads and buildings, are also expected to increase up to 1.5 million kilometers squared across the globe by 2050, which would be equivalent of creating up to 1,185 new Los Angeles metropolitan areas across the globe. And so these large numbers, both the impervious surfaces and the concentration of people in these urban areas, are really important to think about in relation to wildlife, because similar to LA, 462 other cities are also co-located on biodiversity hotspots. And this is because we're often building our cities near areas with rich resources like water, for example, because similar to wildlife, we also depend on natural resources. And these 3 points are really important to hold close, because spatial overlap of terrestrial species, so mammals, birds, reptiles, and so on, and humans are expected to also increase by 56.6%, which means that human-wildlife interactions, which may be positive or negative, are also increasing in and around cities as a result of urbanization, along other factors like climate change. And so understanding the relationship between cities and wildlife biodiversity is essential to kind of inform wildlife management as well as conservation as we dredge further into this biodiversity crisis that we're facing. And so within cities, humans kind of function as these directors, actors, and audience, because cities are spaces that are generally made by humans and for humans, which means that the social side of cities is really crucial for understanding the ecology of cities, because social structures, so things like politics, culture, and management decisions can facilitate or hinder the ecology and evolution of species via things like land use change or differences in resource management, for example. And so traditionally, a lot of folks work between this urban and rural divide, but also you can imagine a lot of other social components can matter, right? So things like when a city began developing, how it's configured, which is kind of shown in this dynamic urban framework panel on the right. And in particular, a lot of research in urban ecology has thought a lot about socioeconomics with concepts like the luxury effect, explaining the relationship between socioeconomics and biodiversity within cities. And so, for example, we can look at an area that's close to where I live in Oakland, California. So these are two neighborhoods that are no more than a 10-minute drive from each other. So we have Piedmont on the left, which is a wealthy, mostly white neighborhood in the Bay. And on the right, we have East Oakland, which is a poor, lower income neighborhood that is mostly Black and Hispanic. And so here you can kind of very clearly see these differences in tree canopy and overall vegetation in these neighborhoods. And this is also reflected in many other cities across the US. And if we follow the density of trees or the amount of tree canopy cover, we can generally follow the money within a city. And you can imagine when there's more trees and more canopy cover, more vegetation, there are likely more organisms. So this is what is typically termed that luxury effect, where species richness and biodiversity are positively associated with income. And we find that income is actually associated with these wildlife communities across the food chain, right? From all the way from the bottom, thinking about trees and insects, all the way to the top of the food chain, including mammals and large birds of prey. And although understanding how socioeconomic status can shape biodiversity can be really useful for identifying potential areas that need funding initiatives, socioeconomic status is often this proxy for larger social processes that shape income. And so it can be beneficial to kind of move beyond this proxy to better understand patterns of urban biodiversity for things like conservation or management. And so there's been a slight shift in ecology to start thinking a little bit more about land use legacies and how our past informs our future today. And so the legacy effects are these long-term impacts from features that persist after their removal from an ecosystem. So this can include things like facilities shown on the left, right, that leave brownfield sites that Jade was talking about before, that contamination that's left behind in the soil long after their removal, or actions like the one shown on the right here with the amount of pesticides used and the type of agriculture planted within a plot having lingering effects on soil health after it's ceased or a crop has been changed. And so one of the main legacy effects in cities that we've been interested in thinking about is residential segregation reinforcement via historical redlining, which shaped and influenced the value of land and where resources were eventually funneled. So briefly, for those that aren't familiar, redlining was a process of differential investment or access to resources like credit based on race in the 1900s, which disenfranchised primarily Black populations in the United States. And so here's what one of those maps of redlining would look like, with Oakland shown here and that blue dot showing me where UC Berkeley is for those that are familiar with the region. And so these maps were created in the 1930s by the Homeowner Loan Corporation, or the HOLC, where they mapped neighborhood investment risks across the US based largely on racist criteria. And so neighborhoods composed of largely immigrant or Black residents were deemed to be quote unquote hazardous. They were given this grade D and mapped in red, which is shown here, and given that term redlining. Whereas these wealthier communities that had more white residents were considered to be the best neighborhoods, mapped in green and given grade A. And so these maps kind of give us this spatial representation of place-based racial discrimination and reflects neighborhoods that would have been redlined by the Federal Housing Association and local lenders. And so today, in line with these grades and their spatial distribution within cities, we see that folks living in these redline neighborhoods have unequal access to wealth accumulation, there's higher rates of poverty, they're more exposed to environmental hazards, which can lead to health issues like asthma and cancer. And at the same time, those policies like redlining that shape the biophysical landscape, so things like vegetation, impervious surfaces, and pollution, have the potential to shape wildlife ecology and biodiversity within cities. But a lot of our knowledge on how redlining actually affects wildlife is very limited, right? So a lot of that knowledge actually sits in the human health and environmental quality literature. So humans living in these previously redlined neighborhoods have higher preterm births, they have worse asthma, worse cardiovascular health, while also being exposed to more air pollution, more oil and gas wells, and higher temperatures. And since my advisor, Chris Schell, and colleagues kind of proposed some linkages between redlining and ecology within cities, such as biodiversity, there's been this one paper that examined bird biodiversity in Los Angeles in relation to redlining, and they found something along the lines of what you would expect. And so throughout Los Angeles County, they found that these redline neighborhoods and neighborhoods with less land value have lower amount of forest-dependent birds. So those are more charismatic bird species like warblers, jays, and woodpeckers, and higher levels of synanthropic birds, so species like pigeons, starlings, house sparrows. And so we wanted to build off of this study by moving outside of LA to see if this pattern was consistent across California, and also see if this remained true beyond birds, so looking at mammals, insects, amphibians, reptiles, and more. But first, we wanted to kind of ground truth our hypotheses to ensure that these redline neighborhoods in California had higher levels of environmental hazards, so things like less vegetation, higher temperatures, and more pollution. And so we use these digitized redlining maps for the 8 cities in California that have their redlining maps digitized. So here I'm showing you Los Angeles. And then I combine these with some environmental hazard screening tools. So CalEnviroScreen, which maps hazards to the census tract level throughout California, and also use some satellite data for things like vegetation to explore the spatial association of environmental hazards with these maps and redlining. And we found that after controlling for how big a neighborhood is, that these non-green line neighborhoods, so from left to right goes grade A, B, C, and D, with the red line neighborhoods being grade D, but they have they have the heaviest pollution burden, and this remains consistent across other pollutants that was put into this larger category. And we see this pattern of non-green line neighborhoods having more environmental hazards being true for noise pollution, vegetation, so less vegetation, and elevated temperatures. And so this is, again, overall environmental hazards within a neighborhood, but we also really wanted to think about these city level differences in environmental hazards. So for example, the San Joaquin Valley in California, which has cities like Fresno, has some of the worst air pollution in the country compared to San Francisco, which doesn't experience nearly as much air pollution. So a value like 80% for air pollution burden in Fresno may be close to the average amount that people experience, whereas in San Francisco, that may be more of an extreme. And so we wanted to calculate a city average and then compare that average of the city to a neighborhood to see, do redline neighborhoods experience disproportionately more than what the average neighborhood might experience? And we found that across each metric that these redline neighborhoods are facing disproportionately worse environmental hazards. So 76% of these neighborhoods in California have more pollution than their average city. 72% have higher noise levels. 86% have less vegetation, and 72% are warmer than their respective cities compared to the much lower proportion of these grade A or green line neighborhoods. If you want to look at this spatially, we can see these redline neighborhoods in California, which are predominantly Black and Hispanic and have higher percentage of folks in poverty, that these environmental hazards are concentrated in these neighborhoods, which likely exacerbate those health disparities I mentioned earlier. So things like asthma, cancer, preterm births, and so on. And so we can begin to see how these redline neighborhoods that have worse environmental quality may also experience diminished wildlife biodiversity. And so we focused our analysis on 4 cities in California: Los Angeles, Oakland, San Diego, and San Francisco. And we found similar to what we would expect based on the LA paper, which is that after controlling for biases within iNaturalist data, which is what we use to understand biodiversity, that LA, Oakland, San Diego, and San Francisco, that these redline neighborhoods are associated with reductions in species richness, which is the number of unique animals within a neighborhood. So I'm showing you species richness on the y-axis in that left figure, and the whole grade on the x-axis. And that these redline neighborhoods also have altered wildlife communities compared to those grade A neighborhoods. And so from these circles, all you need to understand is that those red circles are generally a bit smaller and nested kind of within or different from those green circles. which means that these red line neighborhoods are likely composed of a few generalist species and smaller wildlife communities. So they're likely composed of things like raccoons, brown rats, pigeons, much smaller species pool compared to a more expansive species pool that includes things like bobcats, woodpeckers, more charismatic animals. And when we disaggregated this by clade, we found this pattern to be consistent across each city and for each group of animals. So here I have insects on the top row, birds in the middle, and mammals on the bottom. And so we can begin to see that one of the first complexities in urban biodiversity and conservation is that not all neighborhoods are created equal, right? And that they have varying levels of biodiversity. And to begin conservation efforts across California, it's kind of critical to think about what species are where they are in each city. And so platforms like iNaturalist and eBird that was mentioned earlier are incredibly useful for these efforts. But inequities in society can lead to differences in people who have the time and ability to participate in these efforts. And thus certain areas and cities may have more biodiversity data than others. And so here we can see this, for example, in Baltimore, where areas with more income, so I have income on the x-axis, eBird and iNat on the top two, have more observations, which is that black line as you get more income within the city, and that they have more observation than you would expect based on how big the area is or how many people are actually found there, which is shown by those orange and blue lines. And again, this is consistent across both eBird and iNaturalist. If you want to look at this spatially, again, we can see that in Baltimore that where iNaturalist and eBird observations are also where higher income and more white neighborhoods are located. And this is true in other cities like St. Louis, where you can really see an effective segregation on these data, where that Delmar divide, a road that segregates the city by race right here between these purple and blue dots, also segregates the data in space. And lastly, we can see how differences in participation, right, is driven by inequity leads to these spatial differences in biodiversity data, but also environmental inequities as a consequence of these systemic racial biases can also cause differences in the ability to report species. So for instance, in California, we found that those green line neighborhoods, those green A neighborhoods, which we showed have higher environmental quality, we're also able to detect species in less observations or search effort, with these red line neighborhoods needing over 8,000 observations just to detect the same amount of species. And this result is really important for thinking about sampling neighborhoods equitably, right? So if some neighborhoods have less resources environmentally, we may need more time to sample the species there. And so to kind of wrap it all up, really understand this connection is crucial because urban living and injustice are interconnected such that social inequality is an ecological and conservation issue because these injustices shape our landscapes, both natural and social. That is all I have. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cesar. Your work and Christelle's work has been really incredible, and just thank you so much for all your research and effort. We'd love to figure out ways to collaborate and learn about more, how to apply your research to everything that we're doing to learn about biodiversity. So next, I'd like to introduce Corky Quirk. So Corky Quirk is an experienced environmental educator at Yellow Basin Foundation. She teaches school groups about wetlands and leads the Summertime Bat Talk and Tour program. She also is the founder of NorCal Bats, an organization that provides care for injured bats and educational programs with live ambassador bats. So today she'll be talking about the bats that live in urban areas and that are often overlooked. And she'll even bring in some special bat guests if there's extra time. And her presentation title is Meet the Urban Bats. So go ahead, Corky, and share your screen. And welcome.
Thank you. All right. Did I get rid of all the little floating things? Did I get rid of the?
It looks
okay.
great.
Okay. So my name is Corky, or that's my nickname anyway. And I wear two hats often. Yellow Basin Foundation, I do wetland education and the bat tours out in the summertime. And then I do wildlife rescue with the bats. And so I'll have a little crossover here in talking about our urban bats. I am going to be bringing on one of our little friends here, the pallid bat for sure. And then if I have time, I have a couple other species. But the pallid bat last January became one of our new state symbols. So we now have a California state bat. Now, bats are mammals, right? So they're have a lot of things in common with us and less things in common with the birds, including they do not have hollow bones, which means they have to have other methods of being able to be light enough for flight. And they are the mammals that fly. All mammals that fly are called bats. And they fly with the same bone structure we have in our arm and hand. So if we look at this bat, this is its elbow. So upper arm, forearm, there's a wrist, there's a little thumb, and then 4 elongated fingers. So 1, 2, 3, and this is the pinky finger with skin from the tip of the pinky all the way down to the ankle. And when they fly, it's much like moving our arms swimming the butterfly stroke. So you can see this is a type of a flying fox from the continent of Africa that was living in a museum at the time of the video. You can see how it moves its shoulders, it bends the knuckles on its fingers, all that skin from the tip of the pinky down to the ankle, and their legs are engaged in flight as well. Now, I happen to be in the Sacramento area, and I hang out a lot at the Yolo Causeway, which has a very large colony of bats right at the foot of the state capitol. And Mexican free-tailed bats are quite common in our cities, especially under our bridges, overpasses, parking garages, and sometimes people's personal homes. Here at the Yolo Causeway, they live in the crevices or the expansion joints that are on the underside of the bridge, and they get in there really snug and tight. And one of the fun things about this particular species is that they also fly close to sunset, which means we can see them when they come out because there's still enough light, where some of our bats fly well after dark. Another personal favorite is a bat called the Western red bat, and it lives a very different life than the Mexican free-tail, in that rather than living in these big colonies and tucking themselves away, Western red bats will live hanging in a tree like a piece of fruit. They like the deciduous trees. So this here is a red bat in an oak tree. And if it was near browner leaves, you could see that it would blend in quite well. And I even one time had a farmer tell me he almost picked one in his peach orchard. They are sometimes in our urban areas, and I particularly liked this iNaturalist sighting in that it was in San Francisco. Out during the day, this individual was able to see this Western red bat. Now, that doesn't happen a lot in that they're so well camouflaged, but this individual had the eye. Another one that sometimes we see in our cities are the hoary bats. Hoary bats are a long migrator, we think, although there's a lot we don't know about hoary bats and what they're doing out there. And when I get them, sometimes it's because they've been knocked out of a tree by a jay or a crow. And this is the call that I will receive. Bat on the ground. And of course, the finder is concerned because it's hissing, flailing its wings. What's wrong with that animal? And actually, nothing. It just got knocked down. And soon after they sent me the video, this bat flipped over on its belly, jumped up from the ground, and flew off. Really, the bigger issue is if there happens to be house cats in the area. So some of the issues that they face. We unfortunately do receive a number of them off of fly strips and other glue traps. The survival rate is not zero, but it's not as good as some of the issues we run into. So if you do use fly strips, first of all, they should not be outside. But if they're wrapped in some kind of a wire, even the inside of an old bird cage, where the flies can get in, but the non-target species, including birds, bats, and some of the larger butterflies. I mentioned the cats. We receive a lot of calls about cats caught by house cats. I mean, bats caught by house cats. Cats, of course, are devastating to many of our wildlife. We do also get a number of bats that are found in backyard pools. Many animals, especially during drought, will use backyard pools to swim. And most animals, or not to swim, but to get water, most animals can swim. Bats can swim. But if they land in a swimming pool rather than a pond, they try to swim and get out, but they can't climb the tiles. So if you have a backyard pool or a horse trough or some other kind of water bin, I encourage you to consider a wildlife ramp so that if an animal does fall in, it can get itself out. We need green energy. We need alternatives. Wind turbines, unfortunately, can be devastating for flying animals. And this is from Pennsylvania, but we also have huge issues here in California with the turbines. There are some methods that are being explored to try to figure out how to curtail the death rates. And if you look at this, there's actually considerably more bats that were found under these turbines in Pennsylvania than birds, although birds get a lot of the attention. And if you were able to zoom in, what you would find is that most of those are our tree species. So our red bats, our hoary bats, our silver-haired bats. Here in California, we also have a high mortality of the Mexican free-tailed bats during migration at some of these turbine sites. Also have to mention white nose syndrome. White nose syndrome is caused by a fungus from Eurasia, and it's been devastating bats across the United States. First was identified in New York State in a recreational cave, and it has been spreading both as bats move it around in their own migrations and as we move them, going in and out of their caves. When it gets into caves with the little hibernating bats, 50 to 99% will die. We are losing our bats, especially in the eastern and Midwest parts of the US, although it has not been in our part of the country as long. California looks a little different. We do have a new county added this spring. That's Humboldt County, and that is a positive identification of white nose syndrome on a bat in that county. I believe it was a Yuma bat. So we're very concerned when we lose our bats. What research is showing us is that insecticides go up. And when insecticides go up, human health goes down. There was a study that came out last Thursday showing ties to insecticide use increase due to the decrease in bat populations, causing a 8% increase in infant mortality. And that's not to speak of some of the other health issues. We also, some things we can do, bat houses are an option. I do appreciate bat houses. Bat houses give roosting locations, and some of our bats will roost in places like dead trees, which of course are not very popular in the urban scene. So bat houses do provide those alternatives. Some other things we can do, growing native plants, especially native plants that support insect populations, not using insecticides in our own homes and gardens, and supporting the farmers that also grow their food without those insecticides and other pesticides. Habitat, you can provide roosting locations, but if they don't have a place to hunt, the insect-eating animals are not going to be doing well. Over 50% of the bat species in California are listed as species of concern. So we are worried, and a lot of that has to do with habitat loss. So when we can provide ponds or leave some dead trees on properties, support the land trusts that protect the land, and when either we as individuals or farming communities can put up hedgerows, again, to provide some buffer and habitat. Dark skies, the lighting, you can see those maps all the time about how much more increase. And certain bat species leave areas completely. Sometimes we hear bats will hunt around lights. Most species don't. So if you're looking for diversity, turn off your porch light, use lights with motion sensors so they're only on when they need to be. Encourage parking lot owners to use downward facing hoods. There's a variety of things, again, that we can do. And of course, keeping our cats inside. All right, I want to share with you our state bat. So let's see. First, I need to bring down my screen. And I'm going to change over my camera. And bring that up. So I need to put on my second glove. I do wear gloves with the ambassador bats. These bats are long-term animals. I'm not worried about disease with them. They go to the vet, they get vaccinations, all that kind of good stuff. But they are still little tiny wild animals with teeth. And it hurts if you get bit. And it's also important that, so I'm looking for the bat. It's also important that we remember that people do what they see. And I would never want a person to go out and handle wildlife without proper protection. And come on out, big boy. There he is. Okay. Sorry, he did not want to come out. Okay. Under the camera, here is a pallid bat. So the pallid bat is an incredibly cool species. Get him to focus again. There we go. This bat is found throughout our state, which is one of the reasons why it was chosen as our state symbol. It also is a bat that is kind of golden in color. So golden bat for the Golden State, found in the grasslands, found in the forests, in the mountains, found on the coast and in the deserts. Pallid bats eat a wide variety of insects that are often found on the ground. So these guys are eating things like grasshoppers and potato bugs, and they'll eat large beetles, including cockroaches. They can eat scorpion and centipede, really pretty darn amazing animals. I want to show you his wing. It is long and narrow. No, sorry, long and wide. That allows this bat to jump up off the ground with an invertebrate in its mouth. The wing is skin. Skin heals. Bats sometimes end up with a puncture. Sometimes they get caught by a predator and there'll be a wing tear. With the wing tear, if they come into rescue, often we can help that bat to heal and return to the wild. And then bats have this wide amount of skin between their legs and down their tail. Often people don't realize bats have tails. They have tails. So you can see the tail down the center and then the skin. And that can be used as a maneuvering, so like a rudder. It also can be used as a catcher's mitt to grab an insect both out of the air or, in the case of the pallid, to make itself larger for landing. You may also notice these are not mouse teeth. These are carnivore teeth. So bats have fangs or canines, not large incisors. They are not rodents. They're not even closely related to rodents. They're much closer to the carnivores than to the rodents. How am I doing on time?
You're
doing
doing
good.
well. Yeah. Maybe
Can I
5
show
more
another
minutes.
bat?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right. I want to show the Mexican free-tailed bat if I can get her out. And the reason I'd like to show the Mexican free-tailed bat is because it is a big-time city bat. So Mexican free-tails have really figured us out. We see them in the bridges and the buildings. They fly before sunset. And they're just a phenomenal little species. Much smaller. Come on, focus. There we go. Little round ears with bumps on the edges that come together and make a V right in the center of the forehead. So you can see how they kind of touch right there. That is an adaptation for speed. These guys are super fast. They also have much shorter fur. Longer fur would slow them down. Short fur, less drag, faster flight. You can see the thumbs, the thumb of the bat right there. Little claws on the end. Thumbs are for climbing. And then the Mexican free-tail bat has a long, narrow wing. Things with long, narrow wings fly fast. She wants her wing back. She can have her wing back. So these guys are adapted for speed. They live in massive colonies. Here in California, we'll see them in the thousands, sometimes the hundreds of thousands. And they are considered currently the fastest mammal on Earth. Mexican free-tail bats have been known to fly up to just under 100 miles an hour, beating the cheetah by about 30 miles an hour. Now, sometimes people say, what about a peregrine falcon? This up, down with the mouth, that's echolocation. So she's putting out her sonar, checking out my camera. Peregrine falcons are birds, of course, they're not mammals, but peregrine falcons are fast in a stoop or dive, hunting dive, not so much straight level powered flight. So the free tail on straight level powered flight would win, but in a stoop or a dive, nothing beats the falcon. And the peregrine falcon is a natural predator to a Mexican free-tailed bat. Here is the free tail of the free-tailed bat. I'm seeing that in the chat, my calendar just went up. We have lots of opportunities. If you live in Northern California, we do a lot of libraries, we do festivals, all kinds of things. And here is the tail of the free-tailed bat. The catcher's mitt can be retracted, and little hairy toes, so whiskers on her feet. Whiskers are for feeling, so she can feel where she's going when she's backing up in a crack or a crevice. So those are my two species I wanted to share with you today. Thank you for learning about bats. One of the best things that everybody can do is teach somebody else, because fear is a huge issue for these little guys. When people are afraid, they don't necessarily protect them. So thank you.
Thank you, Corky. I feel like I just got a close encounter with some bats, even though we're just over Zoom. So that was incredible. Thank you so much.
Agreed. Thank you. That was fantastic. And I know
little they are, very little. Oh, here. Really little guy. Okay.
Oh,
I'll put her back with her friends.
Photo. No, thank you for that. And I noticed that one of the links dropped into the chat is for the bat tours at YOLO. And if you have the chance to, if you're in the area or planning to travel through the area and have the chance to attend those, I highly recommend. They're wonderful. Okay, so thank you so much to all of our speakers. We've got a few questions going in the Q&A. If you think of other things as we're talking, again, please do continue to drop questions into the Q&A, and we'll get through as many as we can before the session concludes here at noon. I did have, let's see, pull up my little list here. One question, actually maybe a quick clarifying question for Corky, since this is fresh. We had someone ask, what is the bat's closest relative? Says they've heard conflicting things. What would you consider to be that?
So I like to compare them to the dogs and cats. They're pretty close to the carnivores. But I was recently on a 2-day bat training run by the USDA, and they had a couple of speakers that were doing evolution, and they compared them to flying horses. And if you look at where mammals divide, actually the horses, the dogs and cats, bats, they're not in the same order, but they are on the same branch.
I like flying horses now. I'm always going to think of that. Let's see, one more question for Corky, and then we'll switch it up a little bit. I was wondering if you could, you mentioned this relationship between bats and pesticides. Could you talk about that a little bit more? I think you said,
yeah, so interestingly, Science last Thursday came out with a study that was showing as white nose syndrome moves through the United States, the bats, of course, are dying in huge numbers. We have several species that have lost between 90 and 99% of their population. And what they are finding is when they are in the counties where there's substantial bat loss, there is a 31% increase in insecticides. And in those same counties, when those insecticides increased, there was about an 8% increase in human infant mortality. So there also, just 2 years ago, was a study out very similar that was doing some longevity, looking back at other research about cicadas, because of course cicadas only come out every 13 to 17 years. And they were tracking not only the increase in pesticide use with the cicada increase, large pesticide increase, large human infant mortality increases. But interestingly, as you go forward in time, the test scores of the children born that year in those counties was substantially lower, and the dropout rates before high school ended was substantially higher. So insecticides are impacting us heavily, and we need our natural methods rather, to keep, because of course the farmers can't, with no ability to control the insecticide or insects, they lose too much of their crop.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'm going to come back to you in a little bit, Corky, but let's get to some of the other questions in here. I'll go to Jade next. Jade, there were a couple of questions. First of all, I think you used the phrase parkable communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means?
I think that was an example of mushmouth. It's park poor communities. Park poor communities referring to communities that don't have access to a park or green space within half a mile of their home or residence. Just if we can refer back to the map, you can find that online for the Parks Needs Assessment. There is a huge park and green space deficit in many of the park poor communities throughout LA County.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. I thought parkable communities, that's kind of a cool term too. And then another question for you, Jade, is this might be a clarification question. Was the Catalina Island Conservancy, is that considered or included as a conservancy for the LA County?
So the list of the 3 conservancies that I mentioned were funders for the Parks Needs Assessment implementation process. That was the Baldwin Hills Urban Watersheds Conservancy, Rivers and Mountains Conservancy, and Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. If you do have a link to the Catalina Island Conservancy and they're interested in also participating in this process, yeah, contact me, let me know.
Wonderful, yes. And let us know if anyone is looking to make those connections or needs contact info, and we can certainly do some outreach and make those connections too. Thank you, Jade. Let's take a question for Cesar. General question for you. how can we better overcome bias in community collected data? I know that's a big question. It's not a small or an easy one, but any overall thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's what a lot of scientists who use this kind of data think about, especially on like global scales where we're trying to make large decisions for things like 30 by 30 or larger global goals. I think a lot of it goes back to organizations like what Jade works for, like Nature for All. I think it's a lot of it is rooted in community empowerment and education. I also think some of it when it comes to like just income disparities, if we just want to start there, right? People who are working a lot because, they need to just keep food on the table, keep lights on. There's not a lot of time for recreation or taking kids to parks to recreate. Also, those schools may not have initiatives as integrated that maybe use iNaturalists or lean towards promoting becoming a naturalist, things like that. So I think a lot of it is really rooted in just like social justice and really thinking about how do we better empower communities and support people to also support nature. I think it's really, really highly tied together. Yeah, and I think a lot of work, so the paper that we did, where we kind of I showed those maps of like Baltimore, St. Louis. That paper was really focused on if there's more data than you would expect. And for Oakland, like we didn't really find that there's a lot more data than you would expect along these lines. And I think part of that, there is still a clear difference in observation number, right, in some neighborhoods. But I think some of that has to do with a lot of initiatives in Oakland, like from California Academy of Sciences, I think Holy H2O, et cetera, that really get into community, empower community members, take the time to really just integrate them with these platforms and better report data in their neighborhoods.
That's pretty neat that you can actually see the effect of those types of initiatives or like more local initiatives in the data. That's really cool. Okay, let's see. I have another question here for Corky. Cynthia says the Yuma myotis was found with the disease, I think you mentioned, but not just evidence of the fungus.
Right. So the map is a little funky. It's not funky, that's not the right word, but it's a little deceiving. So the way that the white-nose-syndrome.org tracks these maps is they have open circles, which means the DNA of the fungus has been found in an amplified study, which means it's a possible positive, but maybe not a definite positive. And then the circle gets closed when the DNA is a positive, not just in an amplified setting. And then the county becomes colored when there's signs of the fungus within the bat. So the Yuma bat off a wing swab definitely had white nose syndrome fungus DNA on it, but there was no clinical signs.
A quick follow-up to that, I'm gonna jump and just insert one of my own questions. I'm thinking about the ways that white nose syndrome spreads.
Sure.
Have you it sounds like there's probably a few different ways that can happen, but have you seen any natural conditions that contribute to the spread? I think I work on climate change issues at the department. I get a lot of questions about how climate change may or may not contribute to the spread of different diseases and pathogens. So I've wondered if you've heard of anything like that or know of any connections there.
I don't know of a climate change connection. We do know that bats move it. Because they migrate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some species are affected, some we don't think will be. It is an issue of hibernation. It's a cold-loving fungus. So if it gets on bats that maybe live in a cave in the setting, but are not a hibernating species, they'll live with it, then they migrate, they'll move it. So we're worried about it as it's starting to show up in some of those caves in Texas, for example, where the massive, massive colonies of Mexican free-tailed bats live, and they're highly migratory. It certainly has moved around in the east during migrations, where bats will form up very large colonies for the purpose of hibernation and then disperse during the summer, during the maternity season. but I don't see those as climate. And then, of course, we also are concerned about as humans go in and out of, in particular, caves, picking up the fungus, the spores on their clothes, climbing equipment, boots, whatever, and not properly cleaning that equipment or shoes or whatever before moving on to another place.
Interesting. Thank you. All right, let's see. I've got a question for Jade coming up next. Jade, what are some examples of how you're applying your own 30 by 30 plan to better incorporate urban biodiversity in non-traditional ways?
Sorry, would you mind repeating that question?
Yeah, there was a lot to unpack there. Let me see. What are some examples of how you're applying the 30 by 30 plan or your own 30 by 30 plan to better incorporate urban biodiversity in non-traditional ways?
Well, I think that it might be two things. I think there's a little bit of a disconnect because there is the statewide 30 by 30 plan, and then there's this P&A plus Parks Needs Assessment plus implementation process that Los Angeles County is engaging in, which is Los Angeles's version of 30 by 30. And the reason why it's slightly different from the more traditional ways, because we're taking into account not only access to nature and biodiversity that comes with restoration of degraded lands, but we're also considering all of the needs of the community as we implement LA County's version of 30 by 30. I'm not sure if that answers the question, or if you'd like to want more clarification.
I think that answers it and clarifies like what is the difference. And then if anyone has follow-up, please feel free to type that in. Let's see, our next question here, let me pull up our list. Here is one for Corky. This is pretty location specific. So the question is, where can we go on a bat walk in Southern California near San Diego? If you know of anything specific or perhaps resources for how to locate those types of opportunities.
Well, I know where to go. And when Cindy asked that question, she's your go-to. So Project Wildlife in San Diego does a lot of education. The others that I know of, which are not quite as far south, LA Bat Rescue also is doing great education. And the Audubon Sea and Sage, which I think is Irvine area, do have bat walks. Took myself there for my birthday a few years back. So lots of opportunities, but those would be my two that I would, I'd hit Project Wildlife and ask them because they're in San Diego. They're going to know if it's San Diego specific.
Great. All right. Next question here is for Cesar. What is your favorite urban space for experiencing nature?
That's a good question. I live in Oakland, California. And so Oakland has Lake Merritt, if you're familiar with that. So I do enjoy walks around there, but also San Francisco has a lot of great parks like Golden Gate National Park or Golden Gate Park, which is very expansive. It crosses like almost the whole peninsula. And that was really, yeah, I do love that spot. I'm from Florida originally, where I think urban nature is a bit harder to access. So it's maybe not as emphasized as it is in California. And so being here, I think Golden Gate Park is really great, and also Lake Merritt.
Let's ask the same question of Jade. Jade, do you have any favorite spots, favorite urban spaces for nature?
It's hard to pick just one, but I have to say that I have a soft spot for Eaton Canyon. I know it's a very popular place to be, but I think that that was my first experience in the San Gabriel Mountains is at the Eaton Canyon trails and that nature center out there.
Wonderful. All right, it looks like we have just a couple of questions left here. So if you have others, please go ahead and type those in. Let's see, I have another question for Corky, but Corky, let's start with the same question. Do you have any special places that you like, whether to commune with the bats or just any other types of spaces that speak to you?
I like all kinds of places. I'm in Northern California, so, and going up into the foothills and the mountains, Tahoe, of course, and areas. But then, I spend my days and evenings in the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area, which is a CDFW property. And I just think it's great. It changes all the time. I also, when we were thinking about the bat walks and things, the East Bay Regional Parks, which is going to be more in Cesar's area, East Bay Regional Parks, Sunol and Black Diamond Mine both have bat walks. One has to do more with the building and the other has to do with the mine.
Fantastic. And I think we did get one more comment in here that I just wanted to share with everyone regarding the question about opportunities in San Diego. It says, Cynthia says that Mission Trails Regional Park has volunteers that lead summer bat walks in San Diego. So if you're in that area, you can check that out. Okay, Corky, one more question for you. Let's see. Here. If we want to install bat houses, what do we need to know? In other words, how can we make sure we are attracting bats to a safe place for them, given there may be cats or other threats?
Sure. So there's some basic rules of thumb. You want a bat house to be at minimum 12 feet, 15 feet high. If you can get it on a building, that's going to be ideal because that's going to buffer the temperature changes in the bat house. And if not, then a freestanding pole. If you use a freestanding pole, bigger is better. Again, giving bats an opportunity to move between the various chambers. And the way a bat house is built is those chambers are about 3/4 of an inch to an inch wide. And the more chambers there are inside that bat house, the more opportunity the bats have to move during the seasons. The other kind of rule of thumb, morning sun, about 6 hours of morning sun, so east facing. South can be okay, depending on how hot you are. And then the other thing I like is a device called a pup catcher. Baby bats are called pups. And by the way, each bat usually only has one baby at a time. But the pup catcher, if the bat house overheats, and that can happen in parts of California, the babies will come down to cool off. If they lose their footing, they fall to the ground, they can't get back in. But if they have a pup catcher, they may land in the pup catcher and be able to crawl themselves back up.
Great. And I saw a link in the chat as well with a little bit of additional information on this topic. And we have been sprinkling a lot of links in the chat box throughout, and maybe we can drop some of those in again at the bottom. But if not, do kind of scroll up and take a look. Several different publications that have come up throughout the course of the conversation are now linked there as well. Okay, one final question. This might be for everyone because I'm going to need help answering this. The question is, how does one get into the urban zoology as a field? I think you might need to pave the way here, the person who asked that question.
Yeah, I think it's a really broad question. I think there's different routes. I mean, I think we're all in different sectors, right? And so I think for me, it's, as like when I was an undergraduate, a lot of it is just like kind of reaching out to professors or graduate students. Usually graduate students have opportunities within their groups. So like I, for example, advise like undergraduate projects, and also undergraduates work with me on projects that I didn't necessarily show. So things like putting up camera traps in urban parks, like East Bay Regional Parks, watching those videos, scoring those photos, doing other forms of urban biodiversity capturing. That kind of, I think, provides some foundation to even like push or into a organization like Nature for All or East Bay Regional Parks, things like that. So I think some of it does start at undergraduate. Even if you're high school, I've had high schoolers reach out as well. There's a lot of ways to get involved. I think part of it is just like starting by just like asking, I think, for sure.
Thank you, Cesar, for jumping in on that one. That's good advice.
I would think the professors, of course, may have some tie-ins, but also many of the biologist groups that are doing work out there have connections. So like for the bats, California Bat Working Group has a website on there. There's biologists. They're often looking for volunteers to help with various kinds of research. Again, San Diego has a, Cindy'd have to help me out with this one, but I believe it's the History Museum that does citizen science. And, so there are opportunities out there, certainly, whether it's professionally or as a hobby.
Yeah, and I do want to add on to that. I mean, basically just do it. And I'm glad that Corky mentioned the community science programs at institutions like natural history museums. I know that the Natural History Museum in LA has quite a few programs, including bat count programs, where the public can participate. So you don't have to wear a lab coat to be a scientist. Anyone can be a scientist. So just get started, be curious, and get into it.
That's an excellent ending point, I think, for us for this talk. Thank you for adding on. And I think you all have touched on this, and Cesar said it as well. There are a lot of opportunities out there, but you do just kind of have to look, get out there and look, like you just said, Jade. All right, I'll go ahead and start to wind us down here. We have just a few minutes left before I close us out and shut down the webinar. Any final remarks, comments from any of our panelists?
Well, I'm just going to jump in. I'd love to hear from everyone else too, but this being California Biodiversity Day and thinking about ways in which anyone in California can engage with nature and learn about biodiversity. And I feel like this conversation has really kind of coalesced around the same theme. And so I really thank all of you for sharing about your experiences in these different urban areas of California. So we've got Los Angeles area, the San Francisco Bay Area, Sacramento area, the main urban hubs in the state. And just, thank you for sharing what you know about the biodiversity in those spaces, the ways in which people can access it, and traditional and non-traditional ways to think about conservation in those places. So I've really learned a lot from all of you, and thank you for sharing that today. And I realized I didn't put the link in the chat earlier for California Biodiversity Day, so I'm going to do that right now. Again, there's events happening until the 15th. This next weekend, and it's again organized by many different organizations, local community groups, schools, local chapters, and lots of community science opportunities too.
All right, thanks, Dina. Okay, and a huge thank you to all of our guest speakers for being here. We really do appreciate you taking the time to commit to this and share your work with this group. Very much appreciated. All very interesting, different, but certainly related types of work. So this is very fascinating. Thank you. And we have lots, I won't read them all now, but there's lots of kudos in the chat box as well for you. So kudos from our attendees. And thank you all, of course, for joining and making the lecture series possible with your attendance. Just to kind of close us out here with a couple of quick logistics, we are planning to post the recording of the webinar today. It'll take us a couple of weeks to get it processed, and we'll aim to post that to our lecture series website so that you can take a look, or if someone that you know of might be interested and perhaps missed the talk today, maybe they can tune in as well. All right, with that, thank you all so much for being here. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.